Hello everyone. Right, now today is a video. It's about strategic value of coastlines, but it kind of takes a little bit of explaining as to how this fits into global governance, so I will do my best. The global governance module is firstly about globalisation and migration, and then the second part of the module is very much focused on oceans essentially and all sorts of things linked with oceans. And one of the things that we have to know about is essentially having a coastline is a very helpful thing, and not having a coastline is a very unhelpful thing. Okay, and hopefully the strategic value element will become much more obvious as we go through the video. This is very much going to be an introduction to the kind of themes and ideas that we can absolutely pick up on in class, or it might be enough just to jog your memory for revision purposes. Okay, countries who don't have a coastline are regarded as being landlocked, okay, and you will pick up more on these in year 2, where we do development in an African context, because one of the things we talk about is countries that struggle with their development. And why do countries struggle with their development? And one of the things that we will talk about is, well, actually, if you don't have a coastline, life is really quite tricky for you. So you can see a map with landlocked countries on it, that's shown in purple, and you can see that just by looking at one statistic, very clearly being landlocked there's a problem here. They have 36% less money than the global average. So what is that all about? What's going on there? Okay, the fundamental principle is that having access to a coastline can make you very powerful and very rich. And firstly, the two bits that might pop into your mind, hopefully, are things that we have already talked about, depending on whether you're learning this in order, of course, or not. But one of the things that we have talked about is trade which is done by ships. Trade that's done by ships is 90% of world trade. The vast majority of world trade is done using ships. If you've got a coastline, you can get involved in that. If you don't have a coastline, you either can't get involved, or you have to speak very nicely to your neighbouring countries. In all likelihood, what that neighbouring country is going to do is going to charge you for access to their coastline. It's going to slow things down. It's not going to make you the best kind of trading partner for all sorts of reasons. So that is not ideal. And then the other thing that you might remember is that we have this thing called the Law of the Sea, which was created by the United Nations. And under the Law of the Sea, all coastal countries have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, EEZ. That's 200 miles of resources. Now, it comes down to absolutely potluck what resources you might have in your 200-mile section. But if you don't have a coastline, you don't have an EEZ. You don't have that extra 200 miles of resources. So even without sort of thinking about it too much, it begins to become pretty obvious that having access to a coastline is a pretty lucky thing. But what the exam board want you to know specifically about this is about the British Empire. We are an island. You may have noticed that. Look, I'll prove it to you. We are an island up here. And it kind of makes logical sense that if you are an island, you will have had ships, you will have had boats, kind of as a almost essential part of your defence or of your getting fish or whatever. And what the British did is that they used those ships to go exploring around the world. And when we were exploring, we had a really pretty terrible habit of claiming other places as our own. And that, ladies and gents, became the British Empire. So you've got the definition of an empire there. A group of countries ruled over by a single monarch or ruling power. And there are two reasons that you need to know about the British Empire. for this module, the focus is very much, how did the British Empire make us the rich and powerful country we are? And just remember, the logic is that because we're an island and we have extensive amounts of coast, we had ships. Because we had ships, we started exploring, which then gave us our empire. So we're trying to link this very much back to the fact that we have a coastline, okay? But actually, the British Empire is really important just for your general knowledge. It's the very beginnings of globalisation. There are massive links between we call it the Commonwealth now, but we'll get to that in time, between the Commonwealth and migration. We pick up on it in the Africa module, where we talk about colonialism and the lasting legacy of colonialism in Africa. Montserrat, which is one of your volcano case studies, is in the British Empire. Okay, so it's worth paying attention, I would say, to this. Now, this is colour-coded, and unless you are really interested, I do not need you to get bogged down in when did we acquire all the bits of the empire. But what I do want you to notice is that we gradually acquired our empire as we travelled around the world and added new bits. You can see that we gradually added more and more empire. That is kind of the peak, really. It's a slightly more straightforward map. That is when everything was going, in empire terms pretty well. I'm sure a lot of these countries would disagree with that sentiment, but in empire terms it was going pretty well. Now, you may or may not know that we have actually lost quite a lot of our empire now. We'll do lots more on this in class, but it was mainly the effect of the world wars. We just we didn't have the money or the power to maintain authority. World War II had exhausted us as a country in all, in terms of resources, in terms of money, in terms of the will to do it, in terms of all of it. So after the World Wars, our empire massively declined, and this is what we still have left. We will be talking quite a lot about why. Why do we have any of this left? Because you could argue that maybe we shouldn't. But there are some fairly justifiable reasons for keeping parts like this. And one, depending on the order that you're watching the videos on, one that you might be very familiar about is the Falkland Islands. There is a very good reason that we hung on to the Falklands. And actually they're quite widely spread, aren't they? Could this make sense for military purposes? Could you possibly explain why we haven't let all of these places go? We'll pick up on that in class, but it's worth having a think about, because I don't think, well, actually I know, it's no accident. It's not like we forgot we still had those and we're like, oh, sorry about that. It's a pretty deliberate strategy. So the rise and the fall of the empire. Now, I am not going to show you all of these, obviously, on here, but you will see them in class, or you could get a sneaky peek. Brilliantly, the BBC has got loads of stuff about the empire, and if you scroll down, look, they've got little 3, 4, 5-minute clips about loads of things, all to do with the British Empire, that I would highly, highly recommend that you watch. They are brilliant. The ones that I've directly hyperlinked are, of course, the most useful. So this one, what was the role of money and trade in the British Empire, is good. But you can also, the legacy, the force for good, all of loads of those. Okay, so just a little bit of fact finding about it, and then of course you can always do a good old just Google search. So I've just put in British Empire documentary YouTube, and look, there's a whole hour-long documentary there. There's a 10-minute history. Look, 9 minutes 59. They just squeeze it in. How did the British Empire rule the world, and so on and so forth. So just a little bit of finding out. Let me just remind you, for this module, we are focused very much on what was it about the empire that enabled us to get rich and powerful? But just for your general knowledge, knowing about the empire is really, really helpful. Okay, but that leads to something called the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth is a group of countries that has very strong parallels with the empire. There are some subtle differences that we will pick up on in class, or you can Google for yourselves. But by and large, the Commonwealth is virtually the empire. We don't rule these countries anymore, but we have associations with them, shall we say, okay? And what the exam board want you to know is they want you to have some idea of how the countries of the Commonwealth are linked together. Now, this sort of is very similar to what we were doing about evidence of globalisation, because if evidence of globalisation is the fact that countries are linked together, well, we're kind of repeating the exercise, but we are repeating it specifically, folks, for these countries only. Now, I grant you, it's quite a long list of countries, but it is not just any old country you fancy. It needs to specifically be these. And I'm going to give you some ideas, exactly like I did for globalisation, and then we can pick up on that another time. So 53 countries, 2 billion people. Yeah, big and small countries. I suggest that you try to find 3 links. I don't know why 3. I just think 3 would be plenty for exams without being too many that you're just adding to what you need to know too much. Cricket. Now, when I did globalisation, I rather had a focus on football, so I wanted to change sport for that. But also, cricket is a big part of the British Empire. If you're a cricket fan, you probably know that. But yeah, it's quite actually significant for this, so I felt like I wanted to change that. So you could use cricket as your link between Commonwealth countries. You could use language. Many Commonwealth countries still have English either as an official language or a language that lots and lots of people speak. So you could do that one. Flags, if you're a bit of a flag geek, then quite a few Commonwealth countries will have a Union Jack as part of their flag. So you could talk about flags. You could talk about what side of the road they drive on. That is pretty much one of the worst world maps I've ever seen, but I shouldn't. If I tried to draw, and it would be worse, I'm sure. But you could draw, you could have which side of the road people drive on. You could do relatives. So apparently, 60% of people have a relative living in another Commonwealth country. So you could speak to your family. Have they ever lived, or were they born in any of these countries, or do your family have links to any of these? Could that explain anything particularly? So you could do migration. This one, the Windrush. Now, any of you who are kind of into your politics and your sociology, this would be a really interesting one. The Windrush has become a scandal for the British government. We handled this horrifically badly. Essentially, in a nutshell, we needed people to come over from the Caribbean to come and help us out because we didn't have enough people doing the jobs and we needed more workers. So we kind of asked them to come over and help us out. And then we have pretty much treated them fairly badly ever since. You don't have to do it, but it's quite an interesting Commonwealth link. Lots of controversy if you like a bit of something to get your teeth into. Music. Maybe some of your favourite musicians or bands come from other Commonwealth countries. Military. We have lots of training units in Commonwealth countries. So I've chosen Kenya, but for example, the Red Arrows, they are based for most of the year in Cyprus, which is a Commonwealth country. So you could have military links. You could go for ownership of supposedly British things. You could have the Commonwealth Games. So we had the Commonwealth Games in Australia in 2018, and they will be soon in Birmingham, so you can have that. You can have the Royals. The Royals have to go and do their tours of duty in Commonwealth countries. Anyway, you take your pick, ladies and gents, but just to remind you then, key ideas of this video: make sure you know what a landlocked country is, and the basic idea that being landlocked is a problem and having a coastline is good. Have some idea about the British Empire, not lots of detail, but just some idea about it, so when you get to class you can have ideas on how it's made Britain rich and powerful, and you just have got a bit of general knowledge. And then make sure you've started thinking about some links between Commonwealth countries, whatever kind of links you fancy, really. Okay, well done everybody.